Hey guys, welcome back to another video. So today's Monday little sketchbook video was initially going to be showing you the process of this particular alcohol marker spread of the Herta from Honkai Star Rail, but underneath this little Herta sticky note, I have an unfinished little drawing which I was trying to attempt a certain kind of lighting, but I did not like it. So today, instead of trying to fix up the drawing, I'm just going to completely cover it. So let's go ahead and choose out some supplies and figure out what we're going to do to cover up this particular drawing that I don't really like. So one step to kind of take to kind of minimize the possibility of also hating my cover up, I wanted to sketch out a quick thumbnail of what I wanted to do to potentially kind of fill up the space on this left hand side. So starting off, I was going to use the Prismacolor Kohl Erase in the color Carmine Red to do my sketch, but I noticed that I could not really see my sketch because I had a few other colors and lines already interfering with what I could see. So instead, I decided to pull out the Papermate Inkjoy ballpoint pen in the color purple, just because it fits the color palette a little bit more easier, just in case my lines do show through. So I went ahead and started to sketch something similar to what I had on my little sticky note. I kind of wish I tilted her head even further upwards so that she could look kind of like to the left and down at us instead of just like kind of awkwardly just to the side. So I think that would have worked out better, but for now I was kind of just focused on making sure that I was able to see my drawing to some degree. I think switching to the purple was a much easier way for me to see my drawing because the lines were easier for me to kind of like sketch things a little bit more loosely and then really push the value and the color more so that I could actually see which are my final lines for when we're about to color in our areas. And I tried my best to make sure that the entirety of the page was going to cover up our previous drawing. So to give a little bit of context of my previous drawing, I was going to do a more like backlighting shot, but I did not really plan out the colors beforehand, so I got super lost. But before we talk a little bit more about my previous drawing, I wanted to show you guys what I'm going to be using to kind of cover up our ugly drawing in this case. So I am going to be using a bunch of different Arrtx paint markers. So acrylic paint markers is probably one of the opaque mediums that I enjoy using. The other choice would have been using something like gouache, but I think a lot of you guys know how much I struggle between liking and disliking my gouache paintings. And I think the fact that I would have had a hard time layering up slowly to really see how the colors were going to show up and like cover everything, unless I chose a kind of like a medium that was opaque right away, just because it was easier for me to block out certain areas right away so I could get rid of our previous sketch without having it disrupt and kind of make me feel too confused on what the heck I was even like filling in or what I was going to draw. But for paint markers for myself, a lot of it is kind of similar to both gouache and like other painting mediums, where I'm going to have to really trust the process here because it's also going to go through a weird ugly phase where it's going to be like, maybe I made the wrong choice in terms of like the medium and stuff. It was just hard to kind of see what the final result was actually going to look like until we get past like a certain point. So kind of a little bit more about the previous drawing once again. My idea was to do a video of doing kind of like a full spread, and I wanted to do it entirely with alcohol markers, as in my previous sketchbook I did, I think the main ones were Charlotte from Genshin Impact and Argenti from Honkai Star Rail. So I thought maybe I don't draw like a lot of characters that have a very purple color palette in my opinion, especially like traditionally. So I wanted to draw the Herta instead, but it kind of backfired on me because I was getting a little bit too, I don't know how to explain it. I wish I planned things a little bit more or thought things through so that I wouldn't have came into this weird state of like knowing that I was going to dislike the drawing since the beginning, but then still pushing through and knowing that it wasn't going to work out. So this is kind of the reason why that I want to kind of completely cover this drawing instead of just like my typical posting like sticky notes or even sticker paper and stuff on top of it, where there's kind of like a little bit of ghosting or the ability to really see it. I just really dislike the little drawing that I did, so it's better for me to just cover it up completely with the paint markers and make something that hopefully I like a lot better. But if you're curious, I will be showing you clips of the I guess the right hand side drawings of the two little Hertas on the side so that you can see a little bit of the alcohol marker process, even though like I think 90% of the video will be just me layering up these paint markers. So a little bit more about the process of kind of filling out our spaces. To make sure I got like our negative space or blocking out the character a little bit more, I did end up doing the background first, which is kind of like that mid-tone purple, and then after that I filled in the skin. Now, the problem with using the paint markers at this point, I used the kind of like peach color a heck of a lot in a previous video or two, and because I filled in larger areas, it was actually running out, so the paint marker became a little bit more watery and I started to run out of paint. So even though it usually has quite good coverage, and you can see it like the other paint markers so far are covering everything quite well, the skin's gonna be a little bit more patchy. But not only that, it did end up covering my dark pet, like ballpoint pen purple color that I used to sketch our new Herta. But the previous one, I did end up doing my line work with a water-based marker, which is the Magic Fly markers that I tend to use alongside with alcohol markers because they tend to not really mix and bleed from whenever I've been using it at least. But for some reason, those lines really stand out underneath this kind of like translucent layering of the acrylic paint marker. And the only reason I find this a little bit weird is the fact that a lot of my pen marks are actually disappeared into behind the paint marker, but these lines like kind of remained, so it won't be super evident on camera. You can kind of see it like in her shoulder that's like closest to the left, that you can kind of see the lines popping through. I won't be able to completely cover it because I don't have any similar colors to this particular marker. I think my camera can't really pick it up like on her face, but it is present there too. And from what I'm looking at on my actual sketchbook, like in front of me, it's pretty much only present really in the skin tone areas. So I guess the paint just became way too thin, and for some reason those marks just really stand out. But everything else, like the hair, the hat, and the background, were actually pretty opaque, which was kind of nice. I know some of the white areas, I didn't really go back and forth with layering it up so that it was super opaque and very crisp and clean. I didn't really care too much about it as long as like our main page is kind of like covering up my old sketch or like my old piece. It wasn't exactly a sketch at that point. I also feel like depending on the person and your own sentiment towards like whether or not you want to cover up old drawings that you don't like, or do you leave them as is, or do you like put temporary coverings or stuff like on that, like on top of your sketch, if that makes sense. So typically I usually don't actually cover up my sketch completely like this. If there's sketches I don't like, I either leave them alone and quickly move on so I don't have to look at it myself until we have to do like a sketchbook tour or like a flip through. But if I do need to cover it, I do usually go the method of like something that's a little bit more temporary. So sticky notes or previous drawings that I've done on scrap pieces of paper, I'll stick them into my sketchbook and often cover up drawings like I don't like or I won't miss. But it's kind of like rare that I end up completely covering a drawing like this, or like even using sticker paper to cover up drawings. I usually don't do either. So I don't know what compelled me entirely, besides the fact that I knew acrylic markers would actually work quite well in terms of like covering up a piece, and then we can make something that's kind of like fun and bold in a certain kind of way. So I don't think we're entirely out of the ugly zone for the acrylic marker. I definitely think me adding a little bit of some of the darker colors to define her eyes kind of helped kind of pull it out of that weird state, as well as filling in the whites of her sclera, because the kind of like darker color that I had for her hair was kind of like present in her eyes, and it kind of gave her a weird look. So I was glad that in the end, majority of the areas are going to be covered quite nicely to some degree, and there is kind of like one final step that we'll get into that really ties everything together, which usually is the case for a lot of like the traditional work that I do. Because I tend to do like coloring and sketching first, and then at the very end I like doing inking. So the inking portion will be something that kind of like, one, adds enough contrast to everything, so it kind of gives it that little bit of pop, but also just ties everything together because I'm able to get some sharper lines, help redefine certain areas and objects so that they're not so vague, I guess. But if you're ever interested in any of these like acrylic markers, I do have like individual videos about certain sets. So like the Simptap ones, I think there's like a 48 and 36 colored version of like the felt tip kind of paint markers, and then they have like the 3mm, which I've used kind of like a combination of all of them together. I was more determined to just use the 3mm, which is kind of like the more recent set that I got as a gift, as well as one for kind of in exchange for a video, I guess in this case like a review. But I was missing a few colors that I wanted to use, and the 3mm, even though like they're quite nice and opaque, they're just some places that I won't be able to really line or do like thinner areas without having like a big glob of paint basically. And I tried my best to use like maybe these smaller markers to do some of the fine lines, but in the end, I decided to pull out my calligraphy markers, or like pens. So this one is the one in fine, and I have like a bunch of these calligraphy markers that I've been liking for like inking recently. So I was going to use like maybe one of the harder nibs, or like, you know, like an Ohuhu marker, a fine liner, or something like that sort, even like ballpoint pen. But I wanted to see whether or not, and I did do like a test swatch on like the bottom right hand corner under my sticky notes to see whether or not this pen would even dry on top of the acrylic paint, and it actually dried quite quickly, so I felt comfortable enough to use it to kind of do our line art for this particular little drawing. So the fun thing about this pen, which I've talked about in previous videos, is the fact that the nib is kind of both firm and flexible, so it does kind of give me the opportunity to really play with just using the tip of the pen to get like really sharp or finer lines. Besides the fact that my hand might be shaky at times, then we might get like shakier, thicker lines every so often. But if you press down harder, you can kind of get like a thicker line. So I was able to fill in areas quickly if I needed to, or do finer lines for some detailing. So it was kind of nice to have that control again. And like I mentioned, I do treat the idea of like line work at the very end to kind of help tie everything and tighten up my drawing a little bit more, because it's kind of like that final last step that kind of cleans everything up in a sense. I tend to be a little bit messier when it comes to coloring sketches or like playing with paint markers or like traditional medium, but once I'm able to do the line work, I try my best to be as clean as possible and very deliberate with my line work if I can. To some degree, like I don't want it to be like super clean and pristine, just because one, I know myself is not kind of like, I'm not going to be able to do the inking that I know I want to do, that I see in other people's artwork without having enough practice, by the way. But the other thing is like, because these are sketches and they're already messy to begin with, there's not really a need to make things super clean, especially if it's not for like a final artwork. It's not going to be like a gift to somebody, or like it's not need to be in a certain state, if that makes sense, like of a final result. It can be left as is at any point because it's in your sketchbook. It shouldn't really matter at what stage you leave the drawing. It could literally be like, oh, maybe you just ended up doing like a bunch of guidelines and then, you know, flip the page, start something else. You don't have to come back and like really fix it or finish it at any point. So it's all up to you whether or not you want to continue pushing a drawing to become, I guess, like in your own terms, more finished, or if you want to leave it less finished. It's all up to you. So, But for the inking, I did end up adding a lot more darker areas because I did like the look of kind of like the bolder, darker lines alongside with kind of like the painter, not the painterly lines, what is it called? More flats, I guess, because it's more cell shaded in a sense with the paint markers. But let's go ahead and show you a little bit of the footage that I had for the drawings that I had on the right side. You can kind of see the color difference and just like the difference in the mediums. But I will be showing you very small clips after we show you kind of like an overview, and kind of like it's still unfinished to some degree, but I'm going to be putting our little sticky notes down here to kind of cover it, and it kind of just finishes off the spread anyways. So technically this footage I was going to do for like the main video, and you can kind of see that already when I'm inking, but besides like the footage angle is a little funky. It's like not straight, but it's like not to the side, if that makes sense. But you can kind of see like what I'm using for our line work, which is the water-based markers. It's basically like a dual tipped end marker from Magicfly, and I've liked using these quite a bit. I've always like tried my best to see if I could find any other water-based markers that might work in the same way to even expand more so like my color palette, I guess, that I have available. But the Magicfly one does come with 100 colors, so it's like quite a bit. But I noticed myself like kind of like gravitating towards specific colors for like line work because I need it to be like a certain value usually, or like, I don't know, there's like a preference that I have. I tend to use like brown, blue, or purple often, or like even black sometimes, but for the most part purple is pretty a good color to do line work because I can always like darken it, or if I have one that's a little bit more reddish, it can kind of blend into the skin tones a little bit more and be a little bit less obvious. I'm also a little glad that this wasn't the main video because I didn't realize for quite a while, at least when I was coloring in the skin tone, it was kind of blurry. But you can kind of see that I eventually started to color all of their skin tone all at once, and once I decided that I really didn't like the one on the very left, I ended up just zooming in onto these ones and maybe being like, oh, I could just use the footage of me drawing the ones on the right maybe and do some other drawings at some other point. But I ended up not really liking the entire spread. I think the drawing on the left done with the acrylic paint markers definitely looks more like the Herta compared to the alcohol marker drawings that I ended up doing on the right hand side. I think I definitely still fall into the habit that I would like to sketch the character out more and get used to what they look like and all that before I can draw them more fully, if that makes sense. I've talked about this in previous videos that oftentimes if I want to draw a character, like let's say for a more finished drawing, I end up sketching them or drawing them a little bit more, trying to figure out their outfits, figure out their hair, so that by the time I'm ready to do the sketch for the final drawing, I already have like the gist of their character, and then I can just sketch kind of like a little bit more naturally without having to be like, oh, I have to leave room for this, or like I forgot to add this, or like I don't have to think about their outfits getting in the way, their hair shape and all that stuff. So I think that's kind of what happened here. So I ended up not really liking any of the drawings that I did of Herta, but these ones were, at least to me, a little bit less offensive compared to the one that I did on the very left-hand side initially. So hopefully you guys enjoyed watching me cover up a drawing that I really didn't like in my sketchbook. There was like very minimal bleed through. There was a lot of bleed through obviously from the alcohol markers, but I think that is it for today though. I think maybe next week we'll do a gouache painting, hopefully. I would like to at least attempt to do some gouache painting again in the sketchbook. But I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!